Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. So in the last few episodes we've been covering things like moral development, emotional maturity, who's the adult in the room. And so that's been, really interesting for me to sort of put together because it's actually helped me to think about things like, how these elements, come together to represent, for example, resilience. What makes us as human beings resilient? Okay. But it's also raised other issues as well. And in fact, a little while ago, in the last week, someone asked me a very interesting question. And a question that probably should be asked these days a lot, especially of some of those people who present themselves as leaders in our society, whether they are, in the area of politics, of corporate leadership, organizational development, in professions like medicine, in psychology, in all sorts of areas. We need to, in this day and age, be prepared to question things. And so, the question is, why do smart people believe dumb things? And let me qualify that. When I talk about dumb things, I'm not talking about frivolous things. I'm talking about things that are fundamentally falsehoods, conspiracy theories, or misinformation. Okay, and these days in our environment, we need to be a bit discriminating. There's been a huge problem emerge in our culture, in our society, since the introduction of social media, which has been shamelessly abused by all sorts of people. I'm not sure whether Facebook was designed for this or whether it was as simple as simply hooking people up. But, I'm an open-minded skeptic, and I'll explain in a little while how that works, why that's the case in my situation. But, it's caused some massive problems in our society, in our culture. So how do I answer that question as a psychologist? And ultimately, as a psychologist, my interest is in how we think, what we feel, and what we do. So they're the three sort of legs on the bar stool. Now, all of that represents a field of inquiry that is just massively broad and deep. And so I gave it some thought, and I thought, okay, well, what is it about that? Well, I could argue that it's a form of illusion. Right? I got very interested in the Flat Earth Society at once, and not because I believe that the Earth is flat, but I wanted to understand how people can believe something as so obviously untrue as that the Earth is flat. It's a bit like, in Galileo's time, people believed that the Earth was the center of the universe and everything revolved around it. Well, we know that that's not true, right? And with the Earth being flat number, I'm not sure how many scientific missions into space we need to demonstrate to people that it's not a hoax, that the Earth is round, and that a whole bunch of things that we do on a day-to-day basis actually provide evidence every second that we're going around the planet. And so here's the question. So can we have illusions, cognitive illusions, that are like optical illusions? That is, that we believe things that are not connected simply because somehow we want them to be connected. So with an optical illusion, it's that we're seeing things that are not there or they're different to how they appear. So let me take that another step further. Okay? So let's look at and break this down. So why can smart people, I'm talking people who are in, they've got, lots of life experience, they've got degrees, they're professionals, they are well educated in many regards. But how is it that they come to believe things that are predominantly untrue? Now, one of the first factors involved in that whole process is that a whole bunch of studies have shown that a sustained immersion in a sea of fake news, of misinformation, and excluding people from being exposed to contradictory, true information prepares the soil for that belief in the falsehoods. Okay, so that's a really important factor, especially now when we look at the amount of false information that's channeled directly into our lives on a daily basis. We talk about fake news. Well, how do you discriminate fake from real news? Because unfortunately, there are journalists out there who have ideological aspirations and ideological bents that don't match representing factual information. They taint it. So another issue in this, and this becomes very, very important, especially with media personalities. And to be frank, a lot of people in power are in power not because of what they know and how they know it, but because they're charismatic. They present with confidence rather than competence. Especially a problem with a lot of men in leadership is that their bravado takes up 80% of the space and their competence is lacking. There's a whole bunch of stuff on that which is very interesting, but I won't talk about that now. So, coming back to this, it's trust in the person who is giving you the information. So we're talking about certain types of reporters, we're talking about people in leadership. Okay, so one of the things that I hear progressively from people, in that space of misinformation, so and so told me, therefore it must be true because I believe him. It's a circular argument. Hang on a minute. In most cases, the person doesn't even know the person. I heard this on a series of interviews with people who are believers in fundamentally Trump. It's almost cult-like, where they go, well, Trump wouldn't lie to me. Well, the man has a history of lying, and it's been substantiated. But it's not just the Republicans and Trump. This can happen in any space. One of the areas that it was really evident in was with Nigel Farage during the Brexit campaign. People were told things that were fundamentally factually incorrect. And so, it became again another problem when we started to try and deal effectively with the COVID-19 situation and the issue of vaccinations. It'd been a sort of, bubbling group of anti-vaxxers for quite a while. Unfortunately, the report that suggested that vaccinations were responsible for people's physical and mental challenges, i.e. causes autism and a whole range of other things, that was a single study that was completely debunked. It has absolutely no scientific validity at all, but it stuck. So this is one of the more serious issues in this whole area. Now, another one which is I find really, really quite interesting because I'm exposed to having to review a lot of data, a lot of information on a ongoing basis. Part of it part of it is for my professional development, right? So I've got to keep up PD points. Well, a lot of that depends on me reading a mountain of information. And so one of the things that can happen is when you're reviewing a lot of information is that you don't necessarily give it your full attention. Okay, now that not only applies to reading, but also hearing stuff, viewing things, right? There was an interesting study done by a guy called Norbert Schwartz in the University of Southern California. He asked his students a very simple question. How many animals did Moses take on the ark? Now, I don't know about him, but I would have been surprised to find that only around 12% of the students answered correctly, which is none. Right? And those of you scratching your head at the moment it's not Moses's ark, it's Noah's ark, right? But essentially what's happened is that we connected things intuitively from gut rather than actually sitting down and paying attention and scrutinizing the question appropriately. So that's an interesting experience to sort of reflect on. Okay, so part of the problem is that a lot of people are caught up in the situation where they're not discriminating what they hear, see, and in some instances believe. So, it's challenging. How do we get people to stop being essentially cognitively lazy? Even those people who should be trained, through their degrees, through their education, to be a bit more discriminating. So, in psychology, we use a tool called the cognitive reflection test, and it identifies some people as what they call cognitive misers. I always found that a bit amusing. They might have a lot of brain power that allows them to perform well in exams, but they don't always apply it. They fall back on using intuition and gut instinct rather than reflective, critical, analytic thinking. Okay, so I have discussions with uni students a lot about how do they approach multiple choice questions, and that's where this stuff comes into its own. You need to know your stuff in order to answer correctly. Gut feeling, intuition might get you statistically across the line, but how do you know? Now, one of the other issues here is that our beliefs, what it is that we want to believe in, is highly influenced by our ideology. Now, this is particularly relevant to political ideology. And I mean, the classic example that comes to mind is I remember Trump getting into the whole area of claiming that Barack Obama, is not an American citizen and therefore he is not eligible to run for the presidency. Now, that was consistently disproved to be not true, but lots and lots of people held on to it. Now, come back to the core principle, and then that is that people who believed in Trump and his sort of approach were more than likely to believe this idea that Obama wasn't eligible for the presidency of the United States because he wasn't a citizen. So, no reality, but the belief stuck with a whole range of people. And we can see that also with the issue of vaccines, with the idea that, the EU is ripping us off, right? So, a lot of stuff like that, not only makes people believe things that are untrue, that may even be put into the category of dumb, but it divides us as a society because it, inevitably puts us into two camps. And that's a very sad piece. We should be able to debate and have opinions that are based on critical thinking, that are based on being a bit skeptical, that are based on, in a sense, an ideologically unbiased perspective, if there can be such a thing. Okay, I'll test that out at some point. Now, here's the problem. Most of you, in one form or another, might have had a discussion or a debate with someone who held a false belief, a misconception, misinformation. And most of you would have possibly come away from that experience going, there was no point arguing with that people, because no matter how many facts and how much solid information I presented to them, it got no traction. We got stuck. Now, the part of the reason for that is that most of this occurs at an emotional level. So, presenting facts and information to prove your point isn't necessarily going to get you anywhere. Now, there's been a number of things that have been proposed to do that, and one of the things that a university study showed is that if we, in a sense, inoculate people to false information by presenting them stuff that has been clearly discredited as being misinformation, it'll make them more skeptical. It'll make them more critical of other stuff they're presented with. And interestingly enough, the reference point that they use for that process is inoculation, a bit like stress inoculation. So that can work. My favourite personally is that we should start educating children in primary about how to critically think, devoid of ideology. It is a process. We can demonstrate that process. Scientific is a method based on or incorporates critical thinking. Now, in my case, when someone says to me, what do you believe, what you don't believe, I have to explain that, one, I'm philosophically trained. I'm a psychologist, so that by definition, I'm a scientist practitioner. And so the scientific method is very, very dear to my heart. But philosophically, in a sense, I'm an open-minded skeptic. Show me the evidence. It's a bit like, show me the money. I have a tendency not to believe anything that's simply presented to me as fact. I want to know how they arrived at this particular position, this particular point of view. And one of my missions is to get people to think critically. It's a bit like the gender issue. Men and women are so different, and therefore men are better at navigation, men are better at leadership, they're not as emotional as women, and all this sort of mythology that we constantly get bombarded with by various groups in our society. In today's world, you need to be discriminating. There is so much rubbish that's presented through the internet, on social media, but also on TV. Networks have become ideologically tainted, so you can't necessarily believe, I know this is hard, everything that you hear from your favourite Fox News anchor or Sky News anchor. In fact, they're dubious. Yet people want to make you think that other outlets are equally as dubious. Well, I disagree. And so, that's for another podcast perhaps. But right now, I want people to start thinking critically. Test what you tend to believe with some real fact, with some real sources. Social media and doing your research on Google is not necessarily a good starting point. It could be if you go to reputable sources like journals, but that takes some training to understand some of those. Allow yourself to be open-minded. Allow yourself to take an opposing position. Well, what if this wasn't true? What if it was different? But it takes practice. But the main thing that I'm concerned with at the present time is that this trend in fake news and believing misinformation is separating us into split society where people are truly in distress because of it. And that isn't healthy for the future. So on that note, I'm going to leave you and hopefully touch base with you back next week. And I'm going to pick on a different topic. Until then, think rationally, be skeptical, but most of all, get connected.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at noirtainment, noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.